Thank you, Greg, and thank you, everyone, for allowing me to be here today. I very much appreciate all the effort that's gone into making this special sort of a gathering possible. Um, and, and I'm just mindful of what a trying time we live in so many ways, and yet when one reads the New Testament, if I had to compare living in New Testament Roman Empire compared to today, I'm not sure which would be the better or easier choice. So the times in one sense are different, but in another sense, the same hope that was the Apostle Paul's is ours here today. And so I want to begin with some introductory remarks. In fact, I have about 8 introductory slides that just will help me get things moving in a sense. And I also should say at the beginning that I'm one of those people who knowingly disobeys a lot of PowerPoint rules, right? I put a lot in there, but the reason I do that for various reasons, one of which is because I'm hoping that for anyone who wants to go back to this presentation, on each slide we'll have a certain amount of self-contained information with references, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm hoping that will serve its purpose well. And I will dive into or not some of these slides more or less depending upon the case may be. So I might go rapidly in some cases. And I should also very much say that Greg Allison has done us a great service in such a beautifully condensed and organized fashion, going through so much and covering actually a fair amount of what I'm also going to be reinforcing. So I want to say some things by way of introduction. The first is an important disclaimer. My views do not represent the University of Iowa and do not necessarily reflect the views of any organizations with which I am affiliated. I speak here today as a Christian physician and medical ethicist before a gathering of Christian pastors. And let me also say at this point that how grateful I am for you all and for who you are, what you do in season and out of season. And as I think about you all here today, I think also of one particularly dear friend of mine who is an evangelical free pastor in Bradford, Vermont, Donald Dacey. I don't know if any of you happen to know him. He's been a Christian brother and dear friend of mine for 30 years. And I am so grateful for the encouragement he has been to me in word and deed and prayer over all these years. I am not a psychologist, psychiatrist, or counselor. But one thing I would just say up front is that when I listen to those kinds of experts, I'm impressed at the need to stay clear on the difference between issues of so-called negative emotions, depression and anxiety, versus questions about sex and gender identity. And I would encourage you all to wonder a lot about, listen a lot about, causal or non-causal relationships or associations. That's really important to be clear on what the it is, and that's a complex set of questions. I also want to make it very clear, as a physician who has practiced medicine for many years, I'm not at this time right now in a clinical practice. My work is in clinical ethics right now, but for 25 or so years, I've seen a lot of patients over the years. And actually, earlier in my career, I was also trained in infectious diseases. And so I cared for many years for many patients with HIV/AIDS, including in the state prison system of Connecticut. So I'm here as a physician who believes that physicians should care for all persons, regardless, in this context, of their sex or gender identity. And then also, I think it's important just to say to those around us that our disagreements about gender ideology aim to help and not to stigmatize. And that's a hard one, right? Because the moment we start to have certain kinds of disagreements in our society is the moment we're automatically labeled as being stigmatizing. And you and I both pray for God's grace to not offend unnecessarily, even if what we believe is true does have the effect of sounding or seeming offensive to people. So my intention today is to encourage what is true and good and beautiful, and in that understanding to resist pressures that deny the reality of the goodness of our embodied existence as male and female image bearers of God, and to support means of alleviating suffering that are true to reality and do not harm. That fundamental medical sort of credo, right? That first do no harm, that idea. And then to discuss questions of sex and gender identity and how medical technology is being misused is a biological so-called remedy for what I think is really a psychosocial spiritual problem, i.e. gender dysphoria, which presents with suffering and calls for our compassion and concern. And to recognize that this denial of the goodness and givenness of the body leads to actions that cause harm primarily because they damage the embodied integrity of our humanity, of being a human being. It's only secondarily to recognize additional harmful consequences that flow from this primary inherent harm. And because secondary harms are not the root problem, outcomes data, so-called, about potential benefits and harms should not be taken as being morally decisive. So this next slide is kind of busy, but I do a lot of PowerPoint stuff with teaching medical students, right? So I try to figure out ways to try to give a pictorial representation. What I just said about primary and secondary is meant to say that I think a lot of what you'll hear in discussions is questions of, well, does it help or harm? What kind of outcomes do you get from hormones or from surgeries? And especially, does it decrease suffering of some kind? Does it enhance psychosocial functioning? Does it decrease suicide rates? You'll hear that really often, okay? And there's very serious questions about that. My understanding, just on that note, is that, to my knowledge, when I listen to people who know a lot more about this than I do, is that these transitioning procedures do not actually have a beneficial impact on suicide rates. So we really need to listen in on that. And of course, we live in a society now where people can't even agree on the data, right? So it leaves one scratching one's head as to how do we make progress in that. And yet at a certain point, those data still need to be engaged. But what I'm wanting to focus on here is that as Christians, we use belief and reason and science to say that the primary step toward biological interventions and what I would call language interventions, the whole pronoun discussion, we have to take even the pronouns really seriously because we are playing into an unreality. And I don't believe God ever calls us to play into unreality. That's just not the way God works with us in this world. How pastorally or clinically or as friends or family members we do that takes an enormous amount of sensitivity, patience, and wisdom. But the point is that we must stay true to reality. And so when we're dealing with individuals who have negative emotions and questions about sex and gender identity, we need to think in terms of psychosocial spiritual interventions that then lend themselves towards reconciliation. And you'll see later in another slide where I talk about the so-called biopsychosocial spiritual model of health. And to me, a fundamental big picture point is to say that what is happening in the medicalization of gender dysphoria is that a biological, and of course also linguistic, but biological approach is being used to try to handle a psychosocial spiritual problem. That's a sort of fundamental take-home point. Okay. If you were to interview one of the medical students at the medical school where I teach and say, well, how do you do ethics at that medical school? And do you have any principles? A fair number of them would be able to say, yeah, Kaldjian told us about those 4 principles of biomedical ethics. Right, this goes back to folks at Georgetown from the 1970s. And these 4 principles: beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy, and justice. Huge issues to be discussed with this. The point I want to make right here, though, is to say that each one of those big ideas at the surface are completely unobjectionable, right? Who would not agree with doing good? Who would not agree with not doing harm? Okay, start to unpack that, and now define for me what is good, define for me what is harm, right? And that's where everything begins to, to get very challenging. There's also what I call these mid-level, there's sort of these free-floating big picture ideas that require foundations. We live in a society where people, at least in my secular medical school sort of context, they don't, by and large, at all address the foundations, right? And yet the only way you can unpack problems of definition, application, and prioritization is to have deeper roots and foundations that actually put flesh on the bones of these big picture, more abstract ideas. And we also live in a culture where there is a hesitation, if not a rejection, of the idea of moral absolutes. In fact, the most famous textbook that goes through these 4 principles is unwilling to acknowledge any moral absolute sort of thing. It's unwilling to go there, right? So that's a serious issue. And so from our perspective as Christians now, I've used this language of foundational beliefs and values. I do this in my secular teaching to say that all of us are coming from somewhere. There's no neutrality. We're all we have a perspective. And whether we refer to ideologies, philosophies, religions, or worldviews, that's the sort of thing I'm talking about here when I talk about foundational beliefs and values. And I looked up, as I often do, to remind myself, what's the definition of a word? So ideology, the integrated assertions, theories, and aims that constitute a socio-political program. I believe that's a fair use of a word then when I'm saying gender ideology. And that's just me, plenty of people. Some will say the gender paradigm, some gender ideology. I think it's helpful to call it as it is. There are a lot of distorting dualisms in this context, whether it's body-soul, body-person, biology, mind, feeling, experience, sex, and gender. All of these things tend to they do disintegrate what God has integrated. It's almost like the scripture, let no one take apart that which God has brought together, right? This is already the starting point. And so that partitions the human person and sets those parts adrift without the unity of our creation as ensouled bodies. I will alternatively go between ensouled bodies versus embodied souls, because both are true. So gender ideology denies the integrated reality of our human nature. It tries to rise above the body, as it were, by treating it as an object that can be manipulated by a radically autonomous will. And somebody has nicely pointed out that these are forms of disembodied anthropology. So the two key convictions within our Christian foundations for a talk like this today is the givenness and goodness, right? It's almost like it's a thundering significance that comes through when one really takes this in, and as I know you all understand. And you see the next quotation here. I'm just curious, how many of you have heard of Christopher Watkin so far? Yeah, so my dear friend Donald Dacey brought this book to my attention, and he and I are both reading it together. And I'm only through the first couple chapters, one of which is on creation, which is this quotation is from. And he really nicely writes, both ontology, the existence of things, and axiology, the goodness of things, are equally and inseparably dependent on the divine word. He writes really well. I can't endorse the whole book yet because I haven't read the 600 pages yet, but it's really good. And he really seems to have the gift of articulation of what you know, and yet you think, wow, that's a great way to put it all together. And Tim Keller endorses it with a preface, et cetera, et cetera. So I encourage you, if you haven't seen it yet, grab a copy. I also like in using the word givenness, which people do outside of Christian context as well, I realize that, but I was thinking it usefully connotes both existence and the one who gives it. It's like the word giftedness too, right? Those are, I think, good words to use in our culture to remind folks in terms of where these things are really coming from. So we need grace, truth, and wisdom, and I know that because of how contested these issues are in our society, that someone like myself who speaks with the convictions that I have as a Christian might easily be seen as being ungracious or lacking humility or lacking compassion. And yet, I don't need to tell this group here today that we know that we are all debtors to God's saving grace in Christ, and I am a sinner. And it's not about any difference between me and anybody else. We're all in the same camp of the need for God's grace. And we want to be compassionate, and we are called to understand or respond to suffering. We are called to unconditional love. But I would really contrast that with unconditional affirmation in our society. Those are two very different things, right? Because unconditional love has to be grounded in what is true and good and beautiful. We need wisdom. And it's interesting when you read very thoughtful people about ancient approaches to wisdom, there's this basic sense, going back to the Greeks as well, that to be wise is to conform yourself to reality, rather than wanting reality to conform to you and your will. It's really, in fact, that's what the ancient tradition of practical wisdom or prudence is all about. It's a beautiful discussion, the sense of wanting to be true to things as they are. I mean, it almost reminds me, as I see a piano here, I happen to play the violin, and when I was just, when I tune my violin, if there's a piano nearby, assuming the piano's in tune, I play the A, and then I tune my violin to that A, assuming it's an A440 or something pretty close to that, as opposed to saying, well, hey, why doesn't the piano tune itself to my violin? Right? You see that difference. It's what's the frame of reference, and we know what that is. So we're looking for a reality outside of ourselves that should mold and regulate our internal experience of our interpretations, feelings, and desires. And just a couple scriptures that you know that refer very much to these phenomena in the life that we have in Christ and the need for his changing work in our lives and in our minds. C.S. Lewis wrote, and I'm sure probably everyone has read this before, comfort is the one thing you cannot get by looking for it. If you look for truth, you may find comfort in the end. If you look for comfort, you will not get either comfort or truth. Only soft soap and wishful thinking to begin with, and in the end, despair. So truth is good for us. Our flourishing depends on it. As I like to say, truth is our friend. And like good friends, it sometimes tells us things we may not want at first to hear. So that was the introduction. Now heading further in. So, and again, I'm going to be going pretty rapidly in some of these areas. But biological reality, just a few slides here. What I'm giving you here, this is verbatim language from a document that you can see referenced. If you've got really good vision, you can read it, but I'll help you out here. So it's published by the Institute of Medicine. That's now called the National Academies of Science, Medicine, and Engineering. I might get it slightly wrong, but they changed the name. Same original entities. This is a government-sponsored, I forget what they're officially called. It was a para-government, but in any case, it's a serious deal. So this is an important document published in 2001 that was entitled Exploring the Biological Contributions to Human Health. Does Sex Matter? So you can find this online. And if anybody has any trouble with links or documents, whatnot, feel free to email me and I'll be happy to send you things along. So again, their language. Human beings are sexually dimorphic, male or female. So sexual dimorphism. That's exactly what we heard Greg Allison talking about already today. We have male and female genotypes that result in male and female phenotypes. So it's like the genotype would be like the blueprint. The phenotype is the house. Right? That's just what those words are getting at. And then they use this language. Every cell has a sex. Right? I mean, we are fearfully and wonderfully made. It's just phenomenal to think that that's how embedded, it's like we're completely soaked and saturated with this reality. Okay. So, and I won't read the details there, but that again, it's there for anybody who's going to be online looking at this and wants to take that in. But there's a lot there scientifically. Continuing from the same document. So sex-based, these differences result in different reproductive systems, and there are differences associated with X and Y chromosomes. Certain diseases carry with one or the other. In immune function, in cardiovascular disease, in response to toxins, in brain organization, in pain and pain reception, all sorts of things. It's really incredible how this is the case, that these differences are the direct result, as this document says, of the genetic differences between the two sexes. Period. Last slide from this document is really interesting. That's the box from the document that I've copied and pasted here. It defines sex, gender, and biology. Sex, the classification of living things, generally as male or female according to their reproductive organs and functions assigned by chromosomal complement. It occurred to me yesterday as I was looking at that slide again that they even used back in 2001 the word assigned, right? Sex assigned at birth. Sex is discovered at birth. It's not assigned. It's assigned by chromosomal complement. They use that word correctly there, okay? Gender, a person's self-representation as male or female, or how that person is responded to by social institutions based on the individual's gender presentation. Gender is rooted in biology and shaped by environment and experience. I don't know for sure, but I have a hard time imagining that if this document were published in 2023, I don't think that statement would be in there. But it's there. It's available online in 2001. So what has changed in 20 years? Well, I think you understand that. So in 2001, it was understood that gender is rooted in biology. In 2023, some want to uproot gender from biology and give it over to psychology. I think we just need to be sort of diagnostically clear on what's going on in this regard. Modernity, as you can see, I'm covering big picture ideas, biology, modernity, and what's next, right? Okay. So, expressive individualism and radical autonomy. Again, I know you all know a lot about these things, so I'll be brief here. In the move into modernity, there's a sense in which one could say that whereas ancient wisdom was a matter of letting the objective form the subjective, now we have the subjective forming the objective, as it were, right? So our feelings to fulfill our desires seek to impose intentions on the outside world, even onto our bodies. Nietzsche would be an extreme proponent of this independent will to impose, or the so-called will to power. But more commonly today, we see this in what many have described, or some have described as expressive individualism. If you've never read back in the 80s, Robert Bellah and his colleagues' Habits of the Heart, it had a strong impact on me back then when I read it, and it's really good. And if I recall correctly, he and his group were the ones who came up with this phrase and coined the phrase expressive individualism. Charles Taylor, very serious philosopher from Canada, and Catholic philosopher as well, his Sources of the Self very much engages this as well. And if you ever want sort of the classic, quintessential example of what a statement of expressive individualism can appear like, you can go to our Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy, who wrote, this is in the Casey abortion decision, "At the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life." That's the full form of what that philosophical assessment looks like. You may or may not have come across an intellectual sort of historian and expert in various languages and cultures named Remy Bragg, French. He's got a very interesting book called Curing Mad Truths, Medieval Wisdom for the Modern Age. He's a Catholic philosopher and intellectual commentator, and a real brilliant man. He borrows that title actually from Chesterton's book, Orthodoxy, which is great. It's page for page, one of the best books I've ever read because it's a very slim volume. Okay. And so Bragg, he talks about the modern project, and he said in the pre-modern world, so the medieval world, there was grateful stewardship of a providential creation. The world as creation, and creation as providentially guided blessing to be received. That's that givenness and the giftedness in humble dependence on the God who gives it. Whereas in modernity, we have an independent control of blind nature. The world is nature, and nature now is a human project. Nature, including human nature, is the object of human power, like clay to be manipulated at will. Right? John Paul II, Theology of the Body. In this work, which I have on my desk at home, it's another very thick volume, I've only read the introduction written by, you can see at the bottom, Michael Waldstein, who does us a great favor of writing a long introduction. It's over 100 pages. But it basically allows you to understand John Paul II's understanding on this. And in a sense, what the slide shows is that the first half of the slide is sort of the negative diagnosis, and the second is the positive prescription, right? So John Paul developed this theology of the body to oppose the modern shift to a mechanistic view of the universe, nature, and the human being, which views the body as machine. And he particularly goes after two causes of a rigorous dualism that alienated soul from body. The Baconian, as in terms of the name Francis Bacon, project which made the ambition of knowledge to gain power over nature, including human nature, through technology. This is so important, because if we didn't have the biotechnology we have today, we wouldn't be having a lot of the discussions we're having right now. It just wouldn't be feasible, but it is technically feasible now. And then the Cartesian, as in René Descartes, I think, therefore I am, that Descartes, the Cartesian exaltation of freedom of choice, anticipating Immanuel Kant's focus on individual autonomy as the basis of human dignity as the greatest human good. This is a profoundly helpful diagnostic lens to say this explains why we are where we are in this. And then on the positive side, Waldstein writes, the purpose of the theology of the body is to show the divine plan for human spousal love. I think part of it is a Catholic-Protestant difference, but I find it very interesting. Maybe we can hear from Greg in the follow-up time. I'm sure you know much more about this than I do, but John Paul writes about the spousal meaning of the body, not just people who are spouses and married, but every human being. So it's a very profound sense that I think he's trying to draw our attention to, and basically saying that a Christian view is just so contrary to these modern developments. Medical decision making. I just want to give you a bit of a sense of flavor of how physicians and other healthcare professionals, how they think and work, so you can keep things in mind as you especially think about yourself, yourselves, your family members, your parishioners, whoever it might be. In terms of big picture, this is sort of what we're trying always to do in medicine, right? We're using treatments or tests focused toward goals of care that are supposed to promote human health, that are supposed to enhance human flourishing, right? That's sort of the big scheme. We don't spend too much time talking about human flourishing in my hospital or my medical school, but it's implied, it's in the background. We talk about health, but we just assume everybody knows what it means. We're at a moment now with the issues raised by gender ideology where people have very different views of health. They're competing, conflicting. They're antagonistic in that real sense. Okay, and so if you were to say, well, what do I mean by goals of care? This is from some work that I and some colleagues did over the years just to try to tabulate what are the kinds of goals of care. In fact, if any of you have been in situations, any of you, I'm sure you all have because of your line of ministry, right? End-of-life care, hospice, palliative care. They are the ones who most often use this phrase, goals of care. So the idea of shifting from cure to comfort, for instance, a classic sort of often very challenging and difficult. Some of you your own family members have had some very difficult times of deciding when is it time to now shift the goal of care, as it were. But now if you think about this list, you can think about it in any medical context, heart failure, HIV infection, COVID, anything can apply to the sense of what's the goal of care in caring for a particular patient at a particular time. But consider how these could be invoked by gender ideologues, as it were, because they might say, for instance, well, because of the risk of suicide, we need to do this so-called gender-affirming care. I agree with those who say that that's a phrase we shouldn't even use, because we don't actually believe that those interventions are actually affirming the person's real gender. So I would even encourage us to pause and wonder what even language do we agree with or not. But the idea of living longer could be there. I just saw there was a New England Journal of Medicine publication that talked about whether or not psychosocial functioning was improved in people who went through transitioning. Being comfortable, certainly that has everything to do with suffering and wanting to diminish suffering. So you can see how it's one thing to have this list of goals, it's another thing to decide how to define them and which ones are biologically realistic and ethically justified. Another big picture point here, concepts of health. I'll try to just be brief to say that when I went through medical school, I basically learned the first one, a biostatistical understanding of health, right? Biology, statistics, epidemiology, that's what health is understood as. But by contrast, there also within the philosophy of health, there is this idea of the well-being concept, that the patient as a subject, right? Where now health is the ability to realize one's vital or most essential goals. It's subjective and value-laden. The short answer is, I think, as you can see from the third bullet there, is that there needs to be a combination, right? And I find, so in shared decision-making with a patient, I might believe I think I know what's best for my patient, and I often did, when caring for patients. If my patient is unwilling to share that same perspective, it's a no-go, right? They'll say, thanks, doc, or they might say it in other words if they're not feeling so warmly inclined toward me for other reason. But there's a sense in which, no, it's there has to be a consensus, right? And so it's really important, right, to say that if the biostatistical becomes, shall we say, paternalistic and overrides the human being, then you get the danger of disrespect if it's separated from the well-being. But likewise, if you separate the biostatistical from the well-being, it's dangerous, right? So that both need to be there together. And I think that a nice way to put this together is to use this biopsychosocial spiritual concept of health. I make reference to this in my medical school teaching, right? It's because, and I know the word spiritual is less than ideal from our vantage point in certain ways, but I think we can also appreciate even how I've sort of subtabulated spiritual to get a sense of how I literally talk about that. In that lasting relationship with God, when I say it to students in a secular setting, I'll say, if someone believes in God. So I don't presume that everyone does, of course. But then, so back to this just reinforces the point that I was making earlier about how biological means are being used now to try to address a psychosocial spiritual problem. So I think that's, again, a really fundamental point. So both concepts of health and gender need to be objectively grounded in biological reality. So the givenness and goodness of our embodied existence means that well-being is inherently related to the biology of the body. And gender is rooted in the biology of the body, but the times are challenging that understanding. So, and I'm watching, I said truth is my friend. Sometimes truth comes in the form of time, and time is ticking. So I'll have to be, but I think because both Gregs have set the table so nicely, I'm going to be rapid here. This, again, is for future reference for you. Some of you, I bet, know about this piece. This was published in a lesser-known journal called The New Atlantis in 2016 by Lawrence Mayer and Paul McHugh. Paul McHugh is someone I've heard speak in person, Paul McHugh is a retired psychiatrist from Johns Hopkins. He was the head of psychiatry there. So he's truly an expert in this area. Lawrence Mayer, a biostatistician, and they work together. This is an extensive scientific assessment of issues of sexuality and gender. So I'm going to pass by this right now and now move on to a very busy slide. But this is literally the copied and pasted, you have to subscribe to the DSM5 I can't enter their website, but I found an article that was reproducing this statement of the criteria for gender dysphoria. And it's busy there, but I want to just draw your attention to the following. Its first statement is a marked incongruence between one's experienced expressed gender and natal gender of at least 6 months in duration as manifested by at least 2 of the following. The striking thing here is it's about experience, desire, or conviction. So reality now comes from within. And those outside of that inner reality now are supposed to accommodate or actually endorse and enhance or whatever that inner. So it's really quite striking. But I think it's worth you wondering about this. And when you think about people from your congregations or their children who might be assessed by people who are following these guidelines, this is the official sort of DSM-5 guideline. What's very interesting to me is I came across online a statement from 2013. This is published by the DSM people, right? And they're describing changes made from DSM-4 to DSM-5. And as you can imagine, I didn't go do the historical work of going back to prior DSMs, but you can imagine, that even just the language used to describe these phenomena have unfolded, shall we say. So they point out that they're trying to avoid stigma, but also to ensure clinical care for individuals who see and feel themselves to be a different gender than their assigned gender. They replace the diagnostic name gender identity disorder with gender dysphoria. And they say, you can see that in the last bullet there, they did so because they didn't like the connotation that the patient is disordered. So this is language and stigma concerns, right? And we appreciate that at a certain level. But to the extent that it now starts to denature a realistic understanding, we don't appreciate that. At least I certainly don't. Notice they want to be very clear to say that gender nonconformity is not in itself a mental disorder. They also point out very practically that to get insurance coverage for medical treatments, you need a diagnosis. Because apparently some people in their work group said it shouldn't even be in the DSM. But we need to keep it there so people can have an official, professionally sanctioned diagnosis to get insurance coverage. That's the world we live in. I use this word medicalized gender ideology and transgenderism just to point out just how this has entered into our medical culture. And it is astounding how robustly it has already entered in. And I won't go into those kind of details, but it's astounding, actually. I'll just leave it there. If you want to find out sort of the full form of what this is, go online to this group called WPATH, and that stands for the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. They just published, I think it was just last year, their eighth version of their guidelines for all the things that Greg Allison has already introduced to us this morning. And you can see here that the overall goal of this organization is to provide clinical guidance to healthcare professionals to assist transgender and gender diverse people in accessing safe and effective pathways to achieving lasting personal comfort with their gendered selves, with the aim of optimizing their overall physical health, psychological well-being, and self-fulfillment. And they're very clear. Healthcare systems should provide medically necessary gender-affirming healthcare for TGD people. So this is now medically necessary. And this has gained traction, at least in my institution. This document, I'm being very selective here, it's again over 200 pages, promotes the subjectivity of gendered ideology and yet still also criticizes biology-based beliefs about gender. So notice that middle statement, an individual's gender identity is an internal identification and experience. It's that internal again. And they're ready to say to you and me, so I am a hetero cis-normative person, apparently, on their account. And I, therefore, someone like me, negates the complexity of gender, sexual orientation, and sexuality, and disregards diversity and fluidity. So again, unfortunately, that's how antagonized these things are. I know you know this, but I think it's helpful for you to realize, if you haven't had occasion to come across an organization like this, because I have my reasons to believe that it's this kind of a document that even finds its way into hospital policy manuals as the reference point. Well, because that professional organization, they are the experts, and they are then the ones to be followed, and they serve as the justification for whatever that hospital wants to do. They have a chapter on mental health. They acknowledge that some studies have shown a higher prevalence of depression, anxiety, and suicidality among TGD people than in the general population. Notice them, they go on to say, however, transgender identity is not a mental illness, and these elevated rates of depression, anxiety, suicidality have been linked to complex trauma, societal stigma, violence, and discrimination. And they call for respect for patient autonomy and recognition of gender diversity. And then they're speaking to mental health care professionals. Rather than impose their own narratives or preconceptions, mental health professionals should assist their clients in determining their own paths. To me, I just every time I see just a statement like that on its face value, I think, how can anyone with a straight face ever simply say that there are some people who do and some who don't have preconceived notions? There's no way to engage in the world without preconceived notions of meaning, good, and value. So it's not a question of whether one has preconceived notions, it's whether those notions are justified or not. So, yeah, I don't expect you to be able to read this, right, because I've copied these tables, but it's to give you an impression, a visual impression. This is from the appendix of this document that deals with hormones and hormonal interventions. And what to me is striking as a physician is, over the years, I have looked up literally thousands of times when I'm trying to figure out how to help a patient, to treat a patient. I go to some textbook or some online manual, and I see a table. And I realize, okay, so here's the dose to use, or here's the side effects, or whatnot. It just has this impression of being professionally valid. And so now you go to this appendix and these tables, and you see what looks like, yeah, this is medicine, this is what we do. And yet you realize that this is actually causing harm. It's not actually for the benefit of patients. That's obviously my argument, my conviction. And so it has a normalizing effect of the impression of valid clinical standards and expertise, right? Okay. The surgical procedures. This, I've just, so I could fit it all on one slide, I put it on, this is from the appendix there. the facial surgery, body contouring, breast and chest surgery, genital surgery, gonadectomy, that means taking out gonads, additional procedures, including transplants of certain organs. This is how developed this is. And if we didn't have the biotechnology to do all these things, it wouldn't be there. But such is the nature of the Francis Bacon Baconian Project that began in the 1500s. Now we can control nature and human nature, and now we can marry that to Descartes and Kant's independence of the radical autonomous will, and here we are. Last slide from this document. I was struck by the contrast between initiating and detransitioning, and this is just to make a point here, that when it comes to initiating transitioning treatments or interventions, they say that only a single professional opinion is necessary. But for detransitioning, it says that they should utilize a comprehensive multidisciplinary assessment that will include additional viewpoints. That's just a striking asymmetry, and they don't seem to be bashful about acknowledging that. So once again, talking about a lack of preconceived notions, that's a pretty preconceived notion. And again, and we're chuckling, and I share that sense of the chuckle, and yet this is just how serious an ideology is, and that's what this is, right? And I know that others would look to me and say, well, Kaldjian, you're a Christian ideologue. And I'd say, well, if you want to use that term, I guess, yeah, fair enough. I mean, because I can tell you what my foundational beliefs and values are. So, but I think that's how significant this is. And once again, on the explanations for detransitioning, you can see the kinds of concerns that the folks at WPATH have about what they perceive as all the injustices that are done toward individuals who have other thoughts about their own gender identity. Sources of an ideology. Thanks to Greg and Greg, I don't need to say much here except to put in strong plugs for what's already been robustly plugged. Carl Truman's book is phenomenal. I have been so helped by that. And his diagnostic lens of psychologizing the self, sexualizing of psychology, and politicizing of sex, when I read that, I thought, thank you. Now I understand what's going on. Because otherwise, it is so bewildering to think, how can the current status quo be what it is? That explains how, as a culture, how we've gotten there. Another book that you may or may not have come across is written by someone from Catholic University, a moral theologian named John Grabowski, Unraveling Gender, the Battle Over Sexual Difference. And we already heard from Greg Ellison about the Gnosticism or neo-Gnosticism that is here. And he also writes really helpfully, I think, and in a very sobering way about just this deep conflict between the current ideology and our Christian faith and why things are as tense as they are. So I would encourage you to read that. Another really, really helpful and interesting book is by Abigail. Does anyone know, is it Faval or Favali? I'm not sure how she says her name. She is a Catholic and writes, though, as someone who taught gender studies for 10 years until suddenly she realized she didn't believe what she was teaching. So she's an insider, and she's an insider in the feminist movement as well. And those of us who don't know very much about the first, second, third, and fourth waves of feminism, you can learn a lot from this book in that regard. I just want to, in a very brotherly sort of way, if I can say this, I just want to tag that I came across one thing in that book that I didn't agree with. And I'm just going to say that because if I mention a book, I feel like I'm endorsing it. But I just want to say that there was one thing that I didn't agree with, but there's a ton that I was really helped by, okay? So I would really encourage you to think. In fact, a couple more slides, I'm going to actually borrow from her more directly, but that's another book that is really, really important. So medicalization. It's a sociological term that refers to the attempt to solve a non-medical problem with a medical solution, i.e. treating human conditions and problems as medical conditions and problems that then become the focus of medical expertise and treatment. I'm using this in a slightly maybe nuanced way to say regarding current approaches to gender dysphoria, medicalization can be used to indicate the way that medical authority is being used in an attempt to apply biological means to a psychological, social, and/or spiritual problem. Okay. Let me just read. This is from Abigail Smith, give you a taste of how well she writes. She's a PhD in English, so she's very gifted at her craft. Gender ideology unquestioningly affirms a patient's interpretation of his or her condition. This seems to be the lone corner of psychology where practitioners are encouraged to take a patient's self-assessment at face value rather than testing that assessment against reality. In story after story, I hear descriptions of complex mental distress that is attributed to a single source, gender, and treated to the unproven catch-all solution of medical transition. I'm not surprised that people latch on to the notion of transition as a panacea for all their problems. The idea of a straightforward and decisive solution to layers of psychological distress would be tantalizing to anyone. What's surprising to me are the clinicians, thoughtlessly trotting down the affirmation route like lemmings, unconcerned by the lack of high-quality guidance. Guidance, where was I? Medicalization, sorry. That's just strange. Something is... Okay, it's a timer. I see. The system is telling me that I've got a problem. Okay. Well, does somebody have an override of the system? Okay, listen, okay. But so she ends by saying, gender dysphoria needs to be acknowledged and treated as a psychological illness. I understand the resistance to language of disorder and pathology motivated by a fear that such language is stigmatizing. I understand, she writes, but I disagree. To reclassify disorder as order forecloses the possibility of recovery. What we must resist is the stigma of those who struggle with mental illness. Really well written, isn't it? Okay, can you forbear with me? Give a couple more. I've got about 4 more slides here. So, sorry, I skipped that one. Another taste of Abigail Smith's wonderful book. This gets at this positive sense that's so important for. This is. Somebody wants to challenge my poise as a speaker. Okay, all right. I'll stop the editorializing. I'll just read. The longing for embodied wholeness. I disagree with transgender anthropology, namely its denial of the sacramental principle that the body reveals the person. Trans identities signal a longing for wholeness, for an integrated sense of self in which the body does reveal the person. This desire is fundamentally a good one. It reflects the truth of the human being as a unity of body and soul. The error comes in thinking that this integration has to be achieved through artifice, through violence against the body, rather than recognizing that we are integrated by our very nature. The lie, I have to force my body to reveal my true self, supplants the truth. The body I am is always already revealing my personhood. So she writes so well, the guiding principle should be, do not harm a healthy body. All right, I apologize for this. The need for clinical clarity. This is a piece, find it online, from the Wall Street Journal, May 13, 2016, by Paul McHugh, where he writes, again, in a very public setting, this is a mental disorder that needs to be understood as a disorder of assumptions, right? Okay, and then the second to last slide here, natural law in creation and conscience. Again, you're all being very patient with me right now. Carl Truman writes, Protestants need to recover both natural law and a high view of the physical body. I'll let you mull on that as you're falling asleep tonight, because that's good for all of us. C.S. Lewis talks about the law of human nature, right? Christopher Watkin quoting from Terry Eagleton about the material density and autonomy of God's creation. In a sense, it's the creation itself has its own sort of autonomy that needs to be respected. And then Greg Allison, I found him online from the Gospel Coalition. God reveals himself through both general revelation and special revelation. So some of us grew up in a tradition, Reformed tradition, where we refer to common grace, right? At general revelation. That's what the body and conscience are very much about. So finally, last slide. Love for our neighbors is real only if it's honest. We are trying to be honest about what is good and what is harmful. The definition of harm, to damage or injure physically or mentally. Pretty good definition. Gender ideology misuses medical interventions and causes harm, destruction of healthy tissues, derangement of healthy hormonal systems, interruption of healthy development, mutilation of healthy anatomical organs, destruction of healthy reproductive capacity, i.e. sterilization. Gender ideology distorts reality and language, distorts the body to appease an unrealistic mind instead of changing the mind to reflect the goodness of the body, distorts language by pretending to create reality rather than reflecting it. Christopher Watkin writes so beautifully about the only person who can do that is God, because when God spoke, he created. When we speak, we are naming what he has created. We are recognizing and discovering what he has created. So a Christian approach to sex and gender rests in the givenness and goodness of our bodies, male and female, and recognizes that healing and health must work with, not against, the goodness of the reality God has made. Thank you.